Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitsanu v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Praise to you, Lord of God, rule of the universe, who's made us holy with your commandments and commanded us to busy ourselves with the words of Torah.
Amen.
And with that, let's do some Torah. Starting with the Amidah on 1 foot. Phil, would you please read this?
Make it a little bigger, David.
Ah, yes.
Thank you.
See if I can figure out how to do that. Oh, there we go. There. Okay. Hopefully that's good enough. All right, Phil, would you read our first text, please?
The Amidah is a prayer which makes up the core of every Jewish service. It has 3 standard blessings at the beginning and 3 more standard blessings at the end. And the middle changes depending on whether it's a weekday service versus a morning, afternoon, evening service. On a Shabbat, festival, high holiday, the Nusach, chanting, is also different, helping to delineate the occasion.
Great. Thank you. All right, so this is just a basic introduction of what are we talking about. So this is a prayer, it's in all our services. It's mostly the same every time, and then a little different in the middle, and how we chant it is different as well. And today we're going to be looking at the standard parts at the beginning and the standard parts at the end, because this is much easier than trying to look at all the stuff that's different in the middle. All right. Brenda, would you read our first paragraph, please, or our first blessing?
Praised are you, God, our God, and God of our ancestors, God of Abraham, God of Isaac, and God of Jacob, God of Sarah, God of Rebekah, God of Rachel, and God of Leah. Great, mighty, awe-inspiring, transcendent God, who acts with kindness and love and creates all, who remembers the loving deeds of our ancestors, and who will lovingly bring a Redeemer to their children's children for the sake of divine honor. You are the sovereign who helps and saves and shields. Praised are you, God, shield of Abraham, guardian of Sarah.
Okay, and now some context.
This is the Avot blessing, focused on how our ancestors had such a connection with God, and therefore God should be gracious to us. Hint, hint, God. Some include only Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, because that's a direct biblical quote from Exodus 3:6. And this paragraph is made up of biblical quotes, while others include Sarah, Rebekah, Rachel, and Leah as well, because they each had a relationship with God also.
Is that hint in there, David, or did you put that in there?
The hint is not in the original
Okay.
text of the Amidah,
Okay.
but one could read it there if one so chose.
Okay.
All right, and our very long question.
Ramban explains that the reason why God said God of Abraham, God of Isaac, and God of Jacob instead of God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is because each of them had their own relationship with God, just like siblings have their own relationship with the same parent. How is your relationship with God or your way of doing Judaism different from the generations before you?
Thank you.
What we don't have that the ancestors had, the sages had, was the fact that they spoke directly with God. God spoke directly with them, supposedly. And the same may be said of the prophets. We speak to God directly. I'm not sure how often God answers any of us.
How often God what?
Answers any of us.
I've always wondered about asking you that, David, is when did God stop talking to people?
So it is said that prophecy ceased after the first temple, after the first temple was destroyed, or at least shortly after the return from the Babylonian exile. On the other hand, some say that God speaks to us not quite as directly, but still communicates with us. And it's just a matter of us being able to listen. And then there's a quote from Louis Finkelstein, Rabbi Louis Finkelstein, who was the chancellor of the Jewish Theological Seminary, JTS, who said that when I pray, I speak to God. When I study, God speaks to me.
Okay.
God said he would dwell in the first temple. Did he ever say he would dwell in the second temple?
Not to my knowledge.
David,
Yeah.
at the end of the very end of Deuteronomy, I thought it says that, after the death of Moses, that God, there was never anybody else that had that one-on-one, so well, paraphrasing, of course, one-on-one, that direct communication with God. So then how was it done with the prophets, I guess, different than how God spoke to Moshe?
Certainly. So in Deuteronomy, at the end of Deuteronomy, it says, well, there did not arise a prophet, another prophet in Israel like Moses that knew God face to face. Okay, that's what that says in the verse. So it's explained that Moses was able to see God clearly, and everybody else communicated to God in a like through a cloudy glass, or in dreams. For instance, Isaiah, the book of Isaiah, which we read the very beginning of it on as the Haftorah for Parshat Devarim, right before Tisha B'Av, starts with Chazon Yeshayahu, the vision of Isaiah. So it was different from a direct connection, or as quite a direct connection as Moses had.
I have another question, David, I've often wondered about is G space D. When Jeff, my son, was in confirmation class, he had to write a report.
Mhm.
And Rabbi Tabachnik scolded him because he wrote it this way, G space D. He told him he shouldn't have written it that way.
Yeah.
So what is the appropriate way to do it?
So it depends who you ask. What it boils down to is a concern about the sanctity of God's name. That, like it says in the Ten Commandments, which we'll read in 2 weeks, that you should not take the Lord's name in vain. That's the third commandment. The idea being that God's name should be holy. And so there's a concern by the rabbis that anything that has God's name in it, particularly in Hebrew, should be treated as sacred text. This is particularly this is in an era before the printing press, and certainly before the copy machine. And so something that has God's name in it in Hebrew, like a siddur, should be buried rather than thrown out, or a Torah, even more so. Papers that have God's name on them in English, generally the consensus is that if it is the original document, it should be buried, but if it is a copy of something, then, or like a mass-produced print off of something, then it should be recycled, because this is also respecting God through taking care of God's earth. When it comes to handwriting something, like if you're writing God's name on the blackboard, then, and you're going to erase it, then you would want to write G-D because it's not meant to be permanent.
Yeah.
And it's meant to be erased, and you don't want to be erasing God's full name, even in English. Something like something that's on a website, the reason to put G-D would be if somebody prints it out and then they don't treat it respectfully, then you want to make sure that you don't have God's name in English. So this is like a fence around a fence around a fence around a fence. And some hold by it and some don't. I hold by it. Many people that I respect don't. But there is a source sheet that I wrote on Safari, and I can, share that again for those who are interested.
David, we had the class on it, which you sent that source sheet out on, I believe, if I remember.
Yeah.
Can I ask him, and if this is an inappropriate question, David, cut it off or tell me to stop. But based on the prior question, I'm not sure if I'm the only one who doesn't have the literal, of this group of 20 or however many we are, a literal belief that God spoke literally to Abraham, or spoke literally in that way. I think there's another approach, and it makes it sometimes in the discussions, I don't know how to say or what to say, because I feel that the very literal view of why did it stop then rather than now, rather than the question of, well, how over the centuries have we changed our faith or our beliefs around what that communication, how it would occur, is somehow more to what I wonder in this prayer and general to your question. And am I the only one in this group who, because it makes it a little awkward for me, I guess, who doesn't have quite to the same response of, well, he probably didn't speak literally to Moses or Abraham or Isaac or Jacob in quite such a literal way. And I know that's not a conservative view of God necessarily. It's more my reconstructionist view, but I'm wondering, am I alone of the class in that? Because then I'll be quiet. But if there are others who have any of that belief, I'd like to hear some more of that discussion.
I agree with you.
I think when I talk about God speaking to somebody, I'm not so sure I'm thinking of it in the same way that I'm speaking with you right now. I can accept to some extent that what people received was in a dream, but I'm not really sure if I talk about that as being direct or not direct, because if God is speaking to me in a dream and not to anybody else at the same time, isn't that also considered direct? Sort of on the fence.
And my response on that piece is, it wouldn't be necessarily to me in a dream. It's more, how do we feel, think, conceive of this spiritual part of ourselves and the communication within us around that. That's sort of how I think of it speaking to us, not even in a dream. It can be in daytime, nighttime, whatever. It's just what we find in ourselves.
A lot of this also is the discussion, I think, raises a good point that, when we assign human traits to God, assuming God has a body like we do and a mind like we do, same thing, communication. I mean, some of us make the assumption that communication between God and the prophets or the ancestors is the same communication they were all sharing on a Monday evening. And obviously, I don't necessarily think that's literal either. So I think you really have to find your own your own interpretation, because when we think of communication, God communicating with prophets doesn't necessarily mean the way we're communicating with other human beings.
Right.
So I think it's all part of that.
Thanks, Dan. I agree. Thanks. think I heard enough broader sort of interpretations that I feel a little more comfortable going forward. Not about me, but just about how the discourse occurs amongst us.
Yeah, you're in good company if I'm understanding what you're saying, Alan. Rambam, Maimonides, talked about the idea of anthropomorphisms in the Bible, that because we can't comprehend God in all of God's self, that we use terms that we can understand as people, like speaking, but that's merely a matter of like, what is God doing such that we feel like we're receiving a divine message? And that can look very different for different people. So there's a wide range of views on the matter, and nearly all of them are kosher. Perhaps if you said God split into multiple divine beings that were all equal with God and then expressed multiple opinions, that might not be quite as kosher. But short of that, there are a lot of views that are very good. Let's move on to our next text. This is the Gevurot paragraph. Paul, would you read? Oops, totally missed it. Paul, would you read this, please?
You are ever mighty, Adonai. You give life to the dead. Great is your saving power. You cause the wind to blow and the rain to fall. You sustain the living through kindness and love, and with great mercy give life to the dead. You support the falling, heal the sick, loosen the chains of the bound, and keep faith with those who sleep in the dust. Who is like you, Almighty, and who could be compared to you? The sovereign who brings death and life and causes redemption to flourish. You are faithful in bringing life to the dead. Praised are you, God, who gives life to the dead. Context. This is what the Gevurot blessing focused on God's powers, like we're buttering God up. This line about you cause the wind to blow and the rain to fall is said between Shmini Atzeres and the first day of Pesach, because that's when the rainy season is in Israel. The idea of you give life to the dead has been understood in many ways, including reincarnation of the dead at the time of the Mashiach, the trees coming back to life after winter, and people living on after death through memories of them as well as the impact of their action. Which understanding of this phrase works for you?
Thank you, Paul.
Which one? Because there's a couple of different. Are you talking about the life to the dead one?
Yeah.
Only thing I can tell you is that I've seen enough people come and run like they're half asleep and all of a sudden wake up at a particular time in services. That to me is a form of life to the dead as well.
Excellent.
This doesn't include the afterlife or what we talk about as the life to come. So where does that?
That is another interpretation of you give life to the dead.
I never heard the one about the trees before, but that's really pretty.
Yeah.
Yeah, it really makes sense. It fits nicely because, we add the phrase in the winter, and then in the summer, some texts, it's just about the dew. But I always just kind of thought that was just like a little insertion, because that's how it looks in the Siddur. You insert it depending on the time of the year. But I really like this, how it pulls it together with giving life to the dead and comparing it to the trees coming back to life in the spring. So I think this is great. I think it's a very positive interpretation. I know that, when you grow up in the Reformed tradition, and I think even do it to some, when I was growing up, in this prayer, you said hakol, just life, didn't talk about coming back from the dead. And I know in the Reform Siddurim these days, they have Metim in parentheses, and then most people in the congregation at that point, when they sing along or recite, will say Hakol. So I think if more people in the Reform movement saw this interpretation, I think they'd feel more comfortable about saying on my team, because I really like this about the trees. So that's just my little insight.
I have a question.
Yeah.
My Hebrew is not the best, unfortunately. Is it possible to tell from the Hebrew whether this is directed toward bringing a person back to life, according to how the nouns are in the Hebrew, versus things like trees and so on?
Metim is plural, so you could read that as the trees, but you could read that also as like the many people or the more than one person that is dead.
Would that be a common use of the word for non-human beings?
There's not a lot of reference to non-human deceased beings, but I think they would generally be referred to as metim also.
Oh, okay. I was just wondering.
Yeah, it's a good question.
But it's interesting that, I mean, from early childhood, reading the Amidah and never really thinking about that paragraph. And then I guess it was about maybe 12 years or so, I went to a lecture about resurrection in Judaism. And the speaker referred to this paragraph as, kind of one of the strong points for his argument, that there are many instances of discussions of resurrection in Judaism. But I never really thought about that until he pointed that out. And it's interesting that a lot of times you just read things so mechanically, especially if you don't have the grasp of the nuances in Hebrew, and without really thinking about what you're reading. So
yeah.
This might be
I've always had trouble with that line, but this totally clears it up and makes a lot of sense.
This might be a time I don't have any command of nuances myself, as you know, but this might be a time for a little historical observation or not, that at least some say that the Mechayeh HaMeitim, brings the dead to life, was inserted in the service. I think there's a whole lot of learning on this, but also some controversy, so that those who didn't believe in the resurrection, which was perhaps a novel idea in Jewish life in late Second Temple times, the Minim, or whoever they were, again, there's more controversy, wouldn't be able to say it because people took these blessings seriously. And if they couldn't say it, they wouldn't be there, and we wouldn't have to have them in our midst. And that's there's another blessing on more to the point, but so there was a notion, the whole notion of the resurrection at the end of days or whenever it was, individually or in a group, that this, because the earlier versions perhaps didn't have this. So I just wanted to say that, and for a brief editorial, I want to say that Alan Rosenberg should never shut up, within reason, and that I'm sure his doubts could be expanded beyond, for many of us, beyond just whether God spoke to Abraham, but to whether there is a personal God and whether there is an Abraham. That's all I want to say.
David?
Doesn't the Hashkivenu tell us that God returns life to us in the morning?
I mean, it says that we will, that we will stand in life in the morning. And Modeh thanks God for returning our soul to us at night, or our soul to us in the morning. So there is some historical sense that while we are sleeping, our souls go off and have adventures, and those are our dreams, or what we perceive as dreams. And when we come back, when in the morning, if we're lucky, our souls come back to us and we get another day. And if we're not lucky, game over. So that is their a historical understanding based off of the observed phenomenon that not everybody wakes up in the morning. And an idea of an attitude of gratitude being one of the big Jewish ideas, that we should be grateful for every day that we have, no matter how tough it might be.
Who composes these prayers?
Probably the rabbis.
I'm sorry, I didn't quite hear.
The rabbis.
The rabbis. Okay, so
yeah.
It all depends how the rabbis are seeing things. I mean, this isn't something that came down through Moses that's set in stone. The prayers have been, I have a sense that they've been created and they've been expanded as time goes by.
Yeah.
Even some of the grammar and the language and the vocabulary, from being very simple and some of the basic things, becomes much more sophisticated. From what I understand, the reading in English, because my knowledge of Hebrew is very minimal. But
to your point, Charles, and to Phil's point earlier, yes, none of this was handed down by God, unless you are of the opinion that God dictated the rabbis' creation of the prayers as we know them. However, there is the historical intent behind the prayers, and there is the meaning that we take from it today. So I'm going to guess the rabbis probably were not thinking about trees coming back to life in the winter. That being said, it is a way that one could read this text, or at least the phrase "give life to the dead," and it may work for you. It's about, like many other Jewish rituals, there's the reason that it started, the reason that's given for why it started, and then the layers of meaning that have been piled on top of the ritual over the years, any one of which we can take, or we can come up with our own version, as long as it's not contradicted by the simple meaning of the text.
Anomaly to that, I think, David, in that God said, if we do well, we'll have life. If we do evil, we won't have life. But the trees don't do good or evil. They just do.
David, because this blessing deals with resurrection, historically, I'm just wondering when this was placed here, because it could have coincided with the birth of Christianity, which relies heavily on the concept of resurrection. Any connection there that you know of from a historical perspective?
Yeah. I don't know enough to know when this particular text was written relative to when the idea of the resurrection of Jesus became a thing. But I can try to look more into it.
Thank you.
Isn't there there's a story in the Torah where, okay, can't remember the names of the people, but a woman was crying, and the priest looked at her and said that she was drunk. But she really wasn't. She was really praying for a son.
Yep.
And so then she had a son, and he got sick, and she called the priest back. He laid on top of the son and brought him back to life. I think if I don't have them mixed up. So, I mean, I think some of the prayers, are taken from the Torah, from stories, and so.
Yeah, that's a good connection, Morris. So that's two stories that you are conflating, although easily conflating because they're easily conflatable. There's a story of Hannah from 1 Samuel, who is praying for a son. She goes to Shiloh because this is before Jerusalem was in Israelite hands. And the priest Eli thinks that she's drunk because she's moving her lips, but no sound is coming out. And she explains that she's not. And Eli understands and says that she will have a son. And in fact, the way that she prays has become the model for the rabbi of how we ought to pray. We ought to pray fervently, not just mechanically, when possible, and our lips should be moving when possible. And her son is Samuel, who is the bridge between the judges and the kings. And Samuel is the one that grows up to anoint King Saul and anoint David as kings of Israel. And that story is the one that we read on the first day of Rosh Hashanah, which, side note, there was one year when I was chanting that Haftorah on Rosh Hashanah, and Shira was 3, I think, and she wanted to be up there with me. So like holding my child while reading about a parent praying for a child was like a super meaningful moment. So the other story is the story of Elijah.
Yeah, and Elisha.
There's Elijah and there's Elisha. This one might be Elisha, actually. I have to check if both of them pull this off. We'll go with Elisha here. And this is the Haftorah for Parshat Vayera in Genesis, where the woman asks Elisha for a son. She's like been helpful and given him a place to stay, and she asks him for a son. He says, okay, in a year you'll have a son. And this is tied to the parsha for Isaac's birth. And then like the child grows up, and I don't know, he's a kid, gets a sunburn out in the fields, or sunstroke, says my head, and like basically dies or appears to die. So he's brought in, laid down on a cool bed, and Elisha basically does CPR on him. And it's as if he has come back from the dead. So yes, that story was probably in the minds of the rabbis who composed this paragraph, this blessing about giving life to the dead.
Thanks for clarifying.
No worries.
There's another point. Isn't it that the Hasidim are more prone in their, I don't know how to call it, in their history to believe in resurrection than than rabbis would generally?
To believe in resurrection when the Messiah comes, or
no, not necessarily. No, just in being
reincarnation.
resurrected. Yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
coming back to
So reincarnation, the idea of one's soul coming back in another person is an idea that has credence in Hasidic belief systems, I guess, certainly in Hasidic stories, at least. It is a mainstream Jewish idea as well, but there's but it is one of many possible ideas about what happens after you die. That's kosher in Judaism. The problem being that nobody has been dead for a long time and then come back to tell us what happens after you die. A short time, yes, but a long time, no. So anybody that tells you that they know what happens after they die is either making it up or faithfully transmitting what somebody else made up. So it's guesswork, and therefore, because there's no definite, we have this on ultimate authority or on lived authority, so to speak. There are a lot of ideas about what happens after you die in Judaism. That being said, unlike some other religions, Judaism has not placed a huge amount of emphasis on this matter and more focuses on what we do in our time while we're alive and on this earth. So that's another way that you could interpret gives life to the dead if that works for you. You're certainly within the bounds of Judaism to think that giving life to the dead means your soul comes back in the form of another being to go on another ride on earth, so to speak.
How would the idea of saying Kaddish for a dead person fit into there?
So saying Kaddish for a dead person.
In the sense that you're enriching their soul to rise to a higher place is kind of what I was always told.
Yeah. It's possible that this idea doesn't, that like you get an 11 month cooling off period. So I'm guessing that the way it works with that idea is that you say Kaddish to give the soul 11 months of a better experience as much as one can, or a year of better experience, and then it goes off on another journey. It seems less likely that you'd be saying Kaddish to try to get it into a better next adventure on Earth, but I suppose maybe that's a possibility. I don't know. I will see if I can find anything on the matter. Okay. Other thoughts about how giving life to the dead works for you? Here, let's move on to the next blessing. We're not going to get through all of these today. All right, Herb, would you read the Kedushah, Shachrit, Shabbat Shachrit version?
We hallow your name in this world as it is hallowed in the high heaven, as your prophet Isaiah described. Each called out to the other, holy, holy, holy is Adonai Tzvaot. The whole world is filled with God's glory. Then in thunderous voice rising above the chorus of Sephirim, other heavenly beings call out words of blessing. Praises Adonai's glory wherever God dwells. Our sovereign, manifest yourself wherever you dwell and rule over us, for we await you. When shall you rule in Zion? Let it be soon, in our day and throughout all time. May you be exalted and sanctified in Jerusalem, your city, from one generation to another, ever and ever. May our eyes behold your dominion as described in the songs of praise offered by David, rightfully anointed. Adonai will reign forever, your God, O Zion, from generation to generation. Hallelujah. From generation to generation, we will declare your greatness and forever sanctify you with words of holiness. Your praise will never leave our lips, for you are God and sovereign, great and holy. Praised are you, God, the holy God.
Thank you. And our evening version, or without a minion.
Holy are you, and holy is your name. Holy ones praise you each day. Praised are you, God, the holy God.
Great.
Context, the third blessing of the Amidah is a Kedushah, focused on God's holiness. Its form is different depending on whether one has a minion or not. It is weekday or a more noteworthy occasion, and whether it is a Shabbat festival morning before the Torah service or after it. According to the introduction to the Or Chadash Siddur, the first blessing of the Amidah is about God and history. The second blessing is about God in nature. And the third blessing is about our direct experience of God. When or where have you experienced God?
Thank you.
I think it's easier to see the work of God than to see God's self. I can see a tree, I can see a flower blooming. I can look at it as a work of God, but I'm not sure I've ever seen God directly.
When babies are born,
Hmm.
Even there, it's the work of God.
there's the work of God.
I see people choose to do good rather than bad. I see the work of God.
Hmm.
Or, as I would say it, the God which is within us.
Hmm.
I think about the birth of my children. And sometimes strangely enough, sometimes I've had dreams about certain situations. I don't claim to be any visionary, but sometimes years later, I say, wait a minute, I dreamt about this. This is happening. So I don't know if something was there, some connection. I have no idea, but it's happened on several occasions, not in the recent decade or so, but when I was much younger. So it's curious. I said, now wait, this happened. I dreamt about this. Sometimes I'd be repeating dreams, and then years later, that situation would come up. So was somebody sending me a message or something? Who knows? Was that just a coincidence?
Hmm. Other experiences of God?
May I say, I heard a talk by a conservative rabbi who knows the Litvish, the strictly black hat world pretty well, I think, and it said that in his experience, people were embarrassed to talk about such things. That was something that Christians did, maybe. In fact, they followed the law. They believed in the law. It was given to them. And the notion of a direct experience, well, we had the Torah and we followed it. And that our experience was through the Torah and doing mitzvahs and avoiding averos, iniquities, and so on. And I think that's an important part of that tradition, whatever you think of it.
We always think of God as doing the good things when we see something good happening, and we thank God. But when terrible things happen, like epidemics and holocausts and terrible, I mean, what are we seeing God or not? We like to think it's only good things that he's responsible, she is responsible for. But
Yep.
we don't know if the bad things are also something that's being done to teach us a lesson, or just because it happens and there isn't anything behind it.
Yep.
Questions we'll never really know the answers to.
I think it's interesting too that we're studying the Amidah, which is a way that we pray. It has the silent components depending on if it's the evening or the morning, or, and then there's the repetition and all that stuff. So we get to, during part of the prayer, we get to experience God one-on-one. And then other times, like during the Kedushah, and when the Chazan is doing, especially on Shabbat or on the High Holy Days, it's a very public affirmation. And that's how I would answer this last question on the page. My experience with God, some of it is very personal. It could be, when I see a flower, or when I think of an experience in my life, or a person that's touched me in my life. But then I also think of God as the God of Israel and the thing in God's presence in the world. So I think you can look at it from two very different perspectives. And I think the Amidah is, a great metaphor for that, a great methodology for that.
Great.
I can think of a time when my wife was barely a couple of months into her pregnancy, and for some reason, I know why, but I won't get all those details. We happened to have been down on a remote beach in Costa Rica, and she was beginning to hemorrhage, and there's no way to get her out and save her. And was it a coincidence or no that somebody had just flown in a simple airplane, a one-motor plane, to a small strip down the beach from where we were, and he happened to be there, and they happened to be able to take her back. And well, now that particular baby is, a mature woman with her own children. But there's things happen like that. So was one thing, is that in a relationship to just something being arranged, or was that a good thing or a bad thing? I know, or just a coincidence? I could mention other instances. Who knows?
Yeah.
They say it's beshert.
Beshert. Mhm. God was looking out for you, Charles.
I'm sorry?
God was looking out for you.
Yes, I think he has. On many occasions.
Dave. So similar to what Don was saying, I could think of many examples where I've seen something magnificent in nature, and I would stand back and think this has got to be God's creation. Kind of the grand watchmaker argument in theology, that something so beautiful couldn't happen by accident. But on a more regular basis, I think in Shabbos services, reading the Amidah, and I think the purpose of the Amidah itself is, in fact, to bring us closer to, or as close as we can come to, experiencing God during the service. That when I read that prayer, Kadosh, 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 I have a feeling that the angels are in fact talking to each other and praising God. And we spend much of that prayer praising God. And then at the end, offering our own personal prayers to God. And it gives us a way at least once a week, if not more, to connect and experience God on some level.
Yeah.
In the paragraph above, though, God was spelled out, G-O-D, and here again, it's back to G space D.
Well,
Probably a typo, Dave.
hold on, I will.
I hear God, see?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
So this is the difference between what Safaria wrote and like the translation of the text. So this would be like a siddur except online, and you would treat this respectfully. And this is what I've written.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, good noticing. So with that, I'm going to stop the share.